Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. Just to double check, make sure you're in the right room. Today's Thursday, April 13th. Make sure you're on that page of the calendar. And it is 3:30 p.m. and this panel is entitled An Uncertain Future, Climate Change Concerns for the Next Generation. And I just want to thank you all for being here. My name's Emily Sandoval, and I have the honor of serving as moderator this afternoon. I work as a communications and outreach specialist at the City of Boulder's Climate Department, and I'm also a CU Boulder alum, so it's especially special for me to be here, so thanks. Before we start and thinking about our future and future generations, it's really important to us that we reflect on the past. And so I'll be reading the CWA's land acknowledgement, and as I read it, I just invite you to think about the wisdom from the past and how we can use that wisdom to improve lives in the future. So, the land acknowledgement is, today we would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of Indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those Indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. Thank you. And just one more housekeeping item before we dive into the panel. We've got Charlotte and Clara. You guys want to wave your hands. If you've got a question, what we're doing is asking you to write down those questions legibly, please, on note cards. And they'll be collecting them. Just wave your hand if you have a question, and they'll collect it from you. And we'll try to save some time at the end to get to those questions. That's one of the best parts of CWA. Great, and I probably won't be able to get to all the questions. I may take some creative license to combine similar questions, but please feel free to participate in that way. Okay, so we have a really wonderful panel arranged for you all today, and I just want to give everyone a quick introduction, and then we'll dive into the discussion. To my left here is Dr. Juan Aguilera. He's a physician scientist passionate about advancing public health and reducing public health disparities. Juan has explored the dangers of wildfires and air pollution on pregnancy, circulation, and mental health. He's also spoken about the impacts of climate change effects, like exposure to heat extremes, particulate matter, and food insecurity. So welcome. We've got Dr. Sarah Bexell. She's the faculty director at the Center for Sustainability at Denver University. She also has one of the coolest jobs out there, I think. She works at the Chengdu Research Base researching giant pandas and is a certified panda expert. That's cool. In her work, she aims to help students and society participate in the global movement to protect life on Earth. And she's written what I think is very beautiful. She says, "We cannot ignore the interweaving of life on Earth." Thank you for being here, Dr. Bexell. Next, we've got Wisdom Cole. Wisdom O. Cole is the National Director of the NAACP Youth and College Division. Wisdom has advocated for a variety of youth-forward issues like student debt cancellation, police accountability, removing police from schools, and promoting voting rights. Some of you may recognize Wisdom from appearances on MSNBC, C-SPAN, and other media outlets. And in a 2022 Fight for Our Future rally, Cole urged the crowd to hold politicians accountable for their promises to act on climate. So welcome, Wisdom. And finally, we've got Ariel King. She's an environmental educator, facilitator, writer, and content creator passionate about making environmentalism and law inclusive and accessible to all people. She shines a spotlight on the voices, work, and legacies of those traditionally overlooked in mainstream environmentalism, all while holding space for art, joy, rest, and community in the climate movement. And she's also the director of Black Girl Environmentalism. So welcome. Well, this topic, I think, is a really important one to folks of all generations. But when we think about the future of our climate, one of the questions that comes to mind is really, how are youth going to be able to cope with the future of climate? And Wisdom, I kind of wanted to start with you, because that Fight for Our Future rally that you spoke at, could you give us a sense, like, how are youth feeling about their future right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. One, thank you again for having me here at CWA. This is the second year I've been here and really enjoy the conversations, and very excited to speak with my colleagues who are here on this panel. When we're talking about the fight for our future, particularly at that moment in time, young people are fighting for an investment where we see a real future for ourselves, right? Honestly, over the last couple years, every time we see legislation go up that is in support of education or investing in our climate future, those are the first things that are taken out, right? And so what kind of message does it send to this generation when year after year, when we are fighting for our future, that you're taking it out? Right? And so it's absolutely important that we recognize this generation in time, right? When I think about electoral politics, and I think about the issues that are the most important when it comes to voting years, right? Next year we have a presidential election. In another 4 years we'll have another presidential election. And between those years we'll have midterm elections as well as local elections, right? Something I affectionately like to say that my friend Fallon told me was, it's never an off year, right? There's always things moving, there's always work to be done, and we always have to advocate for change. And so when we're thinking about 2028, when we're thinking about 2032, climate change will be the number one issue for young people in America, right? It already is an issue, a number one issue for Gen Z, but in terms of America and our population at large, it will be the issue that we have to hold our elected officials accountable to and ensure there's actual action around it. And so when we think about our future, we're really in a place where, young people need a new deal. I'm privileged to be a part of a group of change makers from across the country, a part of this group for the Center for Law and Social Policy. It's called A New Deal for Youth. It has brought together change makers from across the country to really put together a platform of key issues that center around climate justice, as well as other key issues for young people that we're going to demand of our elected officials to come through on. And so when we're seeing these historic investments, such as what we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act, that's a great start. But we have to continue to fight for more, right? When we're talking about programs like the Civilian Climate Corps and saying an investment in diverse communities and seeing young people of color have access to that space, are we really meeting young people of color where they're at, right? Oftentimes when we talk about diverse programs to fill these climate jobs of the future, to be frank, we're talking about white women, right? And so we have to be real intentional when we say diversity. We have to really work with partner organizations that have a pulse on what's happening in communities where young people of color are living, and ensuring that they have the opportunity to opt into these green jobs of the future.
Maybe that makes a good bridge to you, Ariel, because you do so much work about accessibility in the climate space. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about what it looks like right now and what you hope to build in that space?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I think what we are seeing right now is a severe increase in a phenomenon called climate anxiety, just the fear of what is to come, and the fear that nothing can be changed, especially because our elected officials and those who are supposed to be in charge of protecting and preserving our lives and our futures are not doing that. One very clear and immediate example of that is the Willow Project that President Biden just approved. For those who are not familiar with the Willow Project, it is a very, very large oil project, fossil fuel project in northwestern Alaska. And part of the 30-year plan for this tremendous facility is, defrosting the Arctic to be able to construct it in the first place, which we know has tremendous impacts to the local wildlife, the local residents, and also to flooding and increased flooding. So this is obviously extremely contrary to what we were promised by President Biden, who made so much of his campaign on climate action and the need to become proactive in climate work. So a lot of Gen Z, especially those who are not able to vote, are feeling very anxious and terrified about their future. Something else that young people are experiencing is climate grief. the fear that there can be no future, and the loss of future livelihoods, future abilities to live free, happy lives on this planet, unencumbered by unequal access to environmental harm and things of that nature that we're experiencing today. So something that a lot of us who are working in this movement are trying to do is to remind young people that there are solutions out there to environmental calamity, and solutions are already in the works right now. And so many of them are being led by people of color, by young people, and there needs to be a way to hold elected officials accountable, but also to reallocate philanthropic dollars to ensure that projects and initiatives that are being led by people of color and by young people can be funded so that they can expand and the impact can actually be felt. And when we're thinking about holistic and just climate futures, it's really just the ability to live freely on this planet and to feel comfortable and safe and be able to breathe the air and drink the water without being afraid, being able to turn on your tap and it be clear. And that's not the case in so many parts of this country and parts of this world. One very clear example of that is the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis that I think not enough people know about. So in the end of August of last year, there was a declaration from the city of Jackson, Mississippi, that the water supply would be shut off indefinitely with no promise of the water getting turned back on. And that was a result of severe flooding that caused stoppages in the water treatment plant for the city. And so any water that was coming out brown and orange, and it's still not fully resolved all these months later. And so we, need to create opportunities for people to become empowered so that they can have options, become involved in decision-making processes, but we also need to listen to those who are most impacted by environmental harm. And I think those are some of the ways that we can create and ensure just climate futures for everyone.
Yeah, there were so many threads there that we could pick up on, so thank you. We were going to go in many directions. But Doctor, I wanted to bring you into this conversation because she mentioned mental health, and I know, as a physician, you might have some insights to share. I assume there's a connection between mental health and physical health, but when it comes to climate change, it seems like it's impacting all of that. Can you talk a little bit about the impact it's having on health in America?
We are seeing more and more effects of that. And by the way, thank you for the invitation and thank you for the audience for being here. I think it's a great way to engage, and so glad to see many faces here interested in the climate change. And for mental health and anxiety, we are starting to see the effects as well. And I feel hopeful, first of all, that the younger generations are becoming more interested because they are seeing climate change as something that's going to be affecting the future and our livelihoods as we go on. And I think the message needs to be shifting from just sharing dire statistics about what is going on, about the mortality rates, the people that have been influenced by death rates of air pollution effects or wildfires, but also talk about, okay, how can we turn all this into actionable items? We need to share with different organizations, especially with our youth, the things that can still be done. How can we work together and collaborate so there's a little bit less stress and anxiety? But at the same time also, for those that have been living with the dire change, not only for climate change, I think now with COVID, it became a huge problem of how some environmental and infectious hazard change our livelihood during all this time and change our lives forever. And now, how as professionals can we address that? New organizations are coming out to say we need to fund more programs to address resilience. We need to address this at the community and personal level. More physicians and healthcare professionals are getting prepared to address mental health problems, to be more informed with climate change. And I feel hopeful, but there's still much to be done in America and in the world. We are recognizing the issues, so I think we can go forward with that.
Yeah, that gives me some hope too. It's nice to see a physician, taking the lead on some of this stuff as well. Dr. Bexel, I wanted to invite your voice into this as well because you and I were chatting before the panel started, and you were saying that you, in your role at DU, you support a lot of students, and I just wanted to know if you could share a little bit about what you're seeing in students and what they're bringing to you, and share about that.
Yeah. I wanted to start maybe with a story that I'm going to be a little vulnerable with you and share something about my career that I'm actually not so proud of, even though I couldn't have known what I was doing. So when I first started teaching at the University of Denver, I'm housed in the Graduate School of Social Work, and we have a really unique program there. We were the first in the world to develop a focus on ecological justice. So really bringing in social ecological systems when social work is really focused just on social systems, but tying and interconnecting human and planetary health. And I was brought in as someone with a science background to infiltrate into the social sciences. And what kept happening, and I was telling Emily this, is my students were coming to my office hours crying. So if any of you are not familiar with social work, these are the folks on the front lines of some of the most awful things that humans do to other humans. Deep, deep poverty, people experiencing homelessness, child abuse and neglect, hospice care. You name it, social workers are fighting some of the hardest fights that we have to face as a society. So I was like, why are they crying in my class? I'm just talking about science. And what I realized, I had to go home, I had to think about this, and I'm like, what am I doing to my students? And I think it's because they all felt that if they played their cards right, they could avoid most of those things that they were seeing happening to their clients. And this was one thing that all of them knew, because I was sharing the science with them. This was going to impact their lives. They were going to suffer too, and they could not protect themselves, their family, let alone their future clients. And so that was a long story to say, I have had to learn how to literally be what is called a trauma-sensitive educator. I still have students cry sometimes. It's getting better, but I am learning. But this is truly how horrific this crisis is for our young people and the mental health strains that they are facing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's just such a emblematic story. You know, there's pain out there when we fully open our eyes to it. So, you know, I would invite any of us to jump in now. We don't have to speak in order, but the idea, let's stick with this idea, right? Like, we've opened our eyes, we've got the IPC reports, and every time there's a new report coming out, it seems like there's a new trove of pretty scary headlines. And I don't know, is there a problem with climate doomism, do we think?
I think that the news, I think that the news is perpetuating climate doomism in very severe ways, in very terrifying ways. Of the very small percentage of climate news and information that's shared online and just in the news, almost all of it is negative. And I think for that reason, when people Google climate change, it's only scary stuff that they're seeing. Not to say that it's not scary. It, of course, is the biggest crisis of our lifetimes, but there are solutions. There are people who are working to create, very impactful change. So I think climate doomism has to be met with just community building and just connection and inspiration and reasons for people to keep going and seek joy. I think anytime that people spend time outdoors, it is an antidote to climate doomism, right? Anytime that you are, I love being in Colorado because I love being able to see all the mountains just everywhere. It's one of my favorite things. But that that helps me overcome my climate doomism sometimes, just seeing like, this is what we're fighting to protect. You know, this is a part of the work, is to, because we want ourselves and our children, our grandchildren, to be able to experience what we're looking at right now when we spend time outside, or want to create and see better than what we're seeing. And so I think that climate doomism, it stuns people into inaction. And we just don't have time for that right now. Like, time is of the essence, and there just is not time to be stunned into inaction. We have to get involved, and now is the time to encourage all people to get involved in climate action in ways that feel accessible to them, in ways that relate to their skills, their talents, their passions, because there is space for everyone in this movement.
I think just to add to that, it's climate doomism without accountability, right? It's everybody talking about these things that have been going on for quite some time, right? Flint still doesn't have clean water. Baltimore doesn't have clean water. There's areas all across America where we're facing environmental racism at large. And there are real solutions that people can take to fix this, right? It's not like there aren't solutions. Like, people can actually create change and implement policy. And what grinds my gears is the lying that happens when folks don't acknowledge the problem and continue to let it fester, right? We know that people are suffering. We know that when there are things happening in our society, that we can take action to change it, right? There are legislations in place that are there to support us, but if we don't have the right people in those positions, they will never protect us, right? They will vie for our vote. And if you've been listening to my panels for the last couple of times, I keep talking about democracy, how democracy is involved in this system. But it's so important that we pay attention to who is going up each election cycle and what issues do they care about the most and what are they actually going to do. No more promises. I want to talk about policy, I want to talk about plans, and I want to talk about implementation, because this has been going on for way too long, and we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I think at a larger scale, America as a whole has to take accountability for how we have impacted the entire globe, right? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the ways in which we are responsible for drastic climate change that's happening across the globe, and what are we doing to support refugees in a real way. And so I think there is an opportunity for us to right the wrongs of the past and to create a pathway forward, but we have to be honest, right? Something I consistently say, something that I've learned from mentors is, and this is if you're religious, God can only bless people if you don't pretend to be something else, right? You can't pretend that we are addressing these issues and fake the funk.
Yeah.
I really like the energy that this panel is sharing. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing a very personal story, because these feelings are there. And as we're mentioning about that sense of doom with climate change, I mean, some of the media even knows that, and it appeals to those feelings to make us engage more in news that it's negative, or that it's gonna make us more angry, and we keep on being fed this loop of information without realizing that we're basically a deer facing the headlights, as Ariel was sharing. We're just seeing it happen, but it's time to take action at the same time. Like, what can we do? We need to start shaping on that. How can we turn these conversations into action? How can everybody here commit to something that's gonna lead to a change in regards to climate change? And Wisdom, thank you for sharing accountability. Accountability. We need to also start holding our elected officials and our communities accountable, because we need that change. We need to start driving that change, whether it's having conversations, making calls, interacting with members of our community, or even across our dinner tables. We need to start having the tough conversations, because if not, we're gonna end up doing what we did with the COVID pandemic, just trying to put a giant Band-Aid on the world, trying to fix a problem that was basically shouting at us since the early publications about how the coronaviruses could morph. Now with climate change, we're seeing the red lights, we're seeing the alarms, and we're still being a little bit passive about it. So how can we pursue this thing and challenge further so we don't end up just patching up the planet? Because if this continues, we might not even be the ones putting the Band-Aid. So it is important to think about how can we start engaging more. And I think what Sarah was trying to also share with her story, feelings are important. So start having these conversations from an emotional perspective, sharing the stories, sharing about how we feel, rather than just making it political across the spectrum and being confrontational. This is something that affects everybody. So we go back to this middle ground where we need to find what unites us in order to create change.
Yeah, I think that's great. Sarah, I see you leaning. Come on in.
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Juan. I think one of the things that when you were asking about doom, and I loved what both Ariel and Wisdom were talking about, it also made me think of something else Ariel said earlier about what is literally being called eco-grief in some of the psychology literature now. And I also wonder if humans as a whole, as a species throughout the world, has to go through almost those stages of grief that many of us, I'm sure, have experienced at some point in our lives. And there are times when we need to sort of fight back and deny that it's happening. There are times that we need to come to that sort of, wow, okay, this is happening. Yeah. And then we need to move forward, as Juan was just saying, and we need to do something about it. And Wisdom, I've gotten to hear a lot from you today too, keeps reminding us too, we can't get stuck in the doom and the gloom or the terror, and we need to be doing something about it. A paper that I assigned to my students that I'm gonna read some of the statistics. They are kind of alarming, but just so you know, folks are out there studying. What are these mental health ramifications? And one reason that folks are studying this is because we don't want young people to get stuck. I spent a lot of my career very stuck. And that's a very dangerous place to be. We have to move people forward. So what are some of those statistics? This is from social psychologists, social workers, and climate-aware psychologists found in a survey that included 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds across 10 countries and in 4 languages, that nearly half of those surveyed say climate anxiety is affecting their daily life. 75% believe the future is frightening. That jumps up to 92% of youth in the Philippines.
Oh.
I think we all know why. 58% said governments were betraying them or future generations. And 39% said they are now hesitant to have children. So while those are alarming statistics, and you might be thinking, oh my gosh, you're teaching and using research like this is so scary. My students read this, and sometimes the very first time in their entire life, they feel validated for those feelings that are just killing them inside. And so I think that's another thing, and I'll stop after this, is those of us who are older adults, whether we have children, whether we have grandchildren, whether we are teachers of any age, we need to become a support system for them to say it is okay for you to move through these difficult emotions so that we can start moving forward. Validate those emotions. Yeah. Those are healthy emotions. Yeah. We should all be feeling them. Mm-hmm. If we're not, that's even scarier. Mm-hmm. And I'll stop with that.
Yeah, I love what you said about validating emotions, because I was talking with some of the producers prior to the start of this panel, and there's this question, I think, among a lot of young people that you raised, 40% I think you cited, are unsure about whether or not they'd like to have a child because of climate change. Yeah. And I think sometimes that could be written off as, oh, you'll change your mind. Yeah, you'll grow out of it. But I think it's really genuine, and I'm just curious if anyone here on the panel would like to share conversations they've had related to that topic specifically, because I think it's very pertinent to young folks today.
It's definitely something that my friends and I talk about, especially as environmental advocates and people who are doing this work. It's like, we are trying our best to create a world that people can live on, and that, you know, we would feel comfortable having children on, and creating a world that we would feel comfortable having our children inherit. Sometimes things are just not happening as fast as they need to. I think, you know, we think about all of the promises of like what needs to happen by 2030 in order for us to have a livable future beyond that year. And it's 2023. You know, that date keeps getting closer and closer, when we are pretty much at the point of no return. And so I think a lot of us are just holding our breath until then, and being very active, you know, getting involved and spreading the word as much as possible to try to encourage other people to get involved and to start considering climate in every profession. And that's what's needed, really, in order for us to try to create something that can last. But yeah, it's scary. And, you know, yeah, 2030 is just, it's right around the corner. But then I also recognize that technology and so many things can happen in 7 years. I think about like what technology looked like 7 years ago, and there are some things that we just like simply couldn't imagine that we have available to us now. And so that gives me hope. But I feel like that has to be met with this level of accountability that Wisdom keeps mentioning. It's really important, and we need to, you know, put people in power and in positions of power who get it, and who are going to uphold the values of human life and of the quality and preservation of the planet.
Yeah, I think that's great. And, you know, we've got a couple of questions here. I want to remind you, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring you a note card. But sticking on this topic of like future, some of these questions that we've gotten relate to population growth and whether or not that's actually the core issue here. You know, so let's talk a little bit about that. What population growth seems to underpin a lot of stuff in our society, whether it's our social security system or economic growth. But is population growth really the problem? Shouldn't the solution be having fewer kids?
I don't think population growth is the problem. I think it's our practice in how we support our economy, how we support our people. You know, this conversation and what was talked about in terms of like the feeling made me really think about some of the cultural practices and solutions that are already, you know, at our fingertips. I'm from California, and in California we have a lot of wildfires, and so that is something that has become a massive problem to the point where many of us, you know, ignore it at a point in time where it's like, oh, it's just another wildfire again. But it is actually becoming a very destructive practice, and you know, folks are doing things about it, but there's more that needs to be done about it. There are indigenous practices that have been tried and trued in ways in which we can implement to prevent those things from happening in the state of California. Is our governor implementing it? Not yet. So that advocacy is absolutely essential, ensuring that we implement those things. And so back to the idea of like, what practices are we putting into place to ensure that as our population does increase, that we're able to provide for everyone, right? Something that I consistently believe, it has to be people over profit. And the reason why we're struggling today is because we're putting the profit before the people. Right. We're putting our money, our dollars, our cents over the lives of human beings who've been connected to this land for decades, right? You know, I think about, you know, the promise to formerly incarcerated slaves or formerly enslaved Africans of 40 acres and a mule, right? When is America going to deliver on that promise and allow folks to come back to what they know in terms of tilling the land and building that structure, right? I really believe that the answers are within, but the question is who is listening and who is willing to actually do something about it.
I would like to add to that, Wisdom. I think it's just amazing. I got to work in California right after that 2020 wildfire that hit the Bay Area. It was just a very interesting time to be there, because many people, as this question of population comes, often address the wildfires problem as something like, well, if you don't want to be affected by wildfires, just don't be living near forests or places that are affected by wildfires. So when eventually the problem comes to them in the Bay Area, where they see this huge orange sky and the Golden Gate Bridge covered by smoke, it became a problem for everybody.
Right.
And for some, the solution was, well, I will move out of this area, but that's not a solution that's even a possibility for many that have been living in that area, or have moved to that area, or even have the resources to deal with that type of solution. However, as Wisdom was saying, there are indigenous practices, there are ways to treat the land, there are ways to handle preventive efforts so we don't face as a higher problem with the wildfires. And some of the work we're doing at Stanford was actually looking into prescribed burning, which is basically you burn certain portions of the area to renew the earth, to actually avoid the wildfire spread. And there were practices that during certain administrations weren't as funded as they used to be, so they contributed in part to the problem, as well as with the increasing climate change. We do see the differences in temperature. So it was a matter of like, okay, these practices are something that we need. And even though there were concerns about the health effects, we were looking into that and saw that the health effects weren't as hazardous when you actually expose people to a prescribed burn, where they get a heads up of when it's coming. They can protect themselves. They can protect the people that are most at higher risk of being affected by the pollution, rather than a wildfire that just wreaks havoc and you cannot control. So prevention is key. And with the bigger scope of the climate change, again, we need to focus on taking the steps necessary to prevent, rather than just letting them happen. And we can learn a lot about the indigenous ways and how it has been handled in the past. So history doesn't necessarily have to repeat themselves, because then we might not see a history for our future.
Yeah, it makes sense. The doctors preaching prevention up here. Makes sense. But can we stick with you for a minute? Because I'm interested in your research about exposure to wildfire smoke. And we're having this conversation sort of about the decision to have children. But I know you've done a little bit of research on impacts to both mothers and fetuses. And can you just share what you found and what research is saying about these topics? Can we expect higher risk pregnancies too as a result of a warmer climate?
It is something that unfortunately we are seeing, just because of how the climate is shifting. For example, in regards to allergy, we do see an increase in the pollen season. It leads to more allergy. With regards to climate change, we do see more wildfires that exposes people to smoke. Also increased traffic. It's leading to particles in the air. These particles, we're learning that it's not also just about the size of the particles and how deep they go into the body. We're learning about what's in those particles. Depending on the wildfires, there's chemicals there. There's heavy metals being lifted from the ground. There's chemicals in furniture. There's increased exposure for our firefighter communities. And in regards to pregnant women and children, we know that increased pollution and particle exposure leads to low birth weight. It increases also the chances of a higher exposure that's going to affect on the long term the genetic mapping that will lead into chronic diseases, obesity, hypertension, diabetes. So there's still much to learn. Right now, our focus is also driven in the immune system, as we learned with COVID, and how can we, first of all, do preventive efforts just by having more information out there so people can have access to air purifiers, face masks, and ways to protect themselves, to have access to cleaner air. But then equity becomes also part of how can we make this an even playing field for everybody to have access to the resources.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said the word equity, because I feel like that's a place where I'd love for this conversation to go. You know, when we think about climate for future generations, there's an equity element as well. So I would invite any thoughts on that thread as well.
I can just very, very briefly, I don't have a lot on that, but I think one of the things that we talk a lot about in our program is intergenerational injustices. And so as we are literally building the economy and the growth all over the planet, we are literally deleting future options for future generations, not just of our own species, but of other species as well. And in fact, we are now within the midst of the 6th mass extinction, driven completely by human behavior. And that's a really difficult thing. This is one of the things that probably makes my students cry the most, because we do tend to like biodiversity. We do tend to like having other creatures and beautiful plants and those kinds of things that make up our ecosystem. And then it goes a step further. We can't live without them.
Right.
Biodiversity is out there creating what used to be called ecosystem services. We're trying to change that language now to ecosystem functionings, because when we see ecosystem services, that makes it sound like, oh, Earth's out there and all the animals and plants are out there doing something for us.
Right.
And that's a very anthropocentric approach. It's all there for me. But if we don't have our bees pollinating our fruits and vegetables, if we don't have healthy wetlands that are purifying our water, and that's not just soil that's doing that, it's all of the organisms that live within a wetland. All of those things have to be happening on Earth in order for us to survive. So that's why it could be a little strange to think about the program I mentioned earlier. We're teaching ecological justice within social work, which is a profession that is dedicated, for the most part, solely for health and well-being of humans. And we had to very actively lift up the natural world on equal playing ground with just one species, that's ours, in order to protect that one species. So when we think about equity, we can't manage it within our own species. We suck at that, if I may say.
You may. Please,
Oh
say
my
it again.
God, we are horrific
Yeah.
to each other. If we can't sort that out, how will we have the wherewithal to protect the planet and all the other species out there doing just what they like to do,
Right.
so that we can thrive as well? We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about makes me think. I feel like I did a lot of thinking during the COVID pandemic, and I feel like we're still existing in it. But a lot of the messaging that was given during that period of time, particularly towards young people, was we need you to do your part. We need you to stay inside. We need you to not be moving around, because this impacts all of us, and you have to do your job to ensure that we can make it out of this, right? Okay, that makes sense. But for years and years and years, when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about equitable policy to support our future, we're denied, right? And so at the end of the day, we're going to learn from our elders. We're going to learn from our teachers. We're going to learn from the people who have made the way for us to be here today. And so I think it's absolutely important that when we're thinking about equity, we have to think about righting the wrongs of the past, right? The ways in which we have done harm to our planet, the ways in which we have done harm to the younger generations. Folks ask me all the time why young people are apathetic about voting, why young people don't turn out. One, it's not true, but two, we've seen time after time our elected leaders steal, cheat, lie, and deny us our future. And so when I think about what's necessary for equity when it comes to climate change, my mind goes to green new jobs, right? When we're talking about green new jobs, how do we actually structure that in a way where people from the most marginalized communities, people who are impacted directly by the most pressing climate issues in our society today, have access to those jobs, right? Oftentimes we're not seeing those people in those places and spaces because they're being denied. But also the thing is that we have the tools to fix the concurrent issues that are happening in our community. I've been having conversations with different government organizations talking about how we can get Black students into STEM and STEAM, right? They want to see more Black astronauts, more Black scientists, more Black folks in these spaces that are rethinking the way in which we address climate change. But you have the solutions to support our community, right? How can we go into Flint and use the tools and technology that we have at NASA, that we have at some of these high-end scientific labs, and actually address this solution, right? If you are not changing my lived reality, I can't see further than that.
Right. Right.
If you are not changing what is happening in my lived circumstances in my day-to-day, I can't even get to the future.
Right.
So we have to do the work to address the problems today to ensure that we can have it tomorrow.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, that's just so exactly right. And to bring it back to, like, you know, the desire to have children, I think just thinking about that as a Black woman, I think beyond just the whatever future we're going to, like, you know, allow our children to inherit, there are like severe challenges and, you know, scary things related to pregnancy and birthing for people of color, but specifically for Black women. I'm from New York State, and in New York State, the mortality rate for Black women during pregnancy is like 4 times higher than the rest of the U.S. And we are still like seeing in the medical profession that they're perpetuating narratives that based on skin color there are different experiences related to pain tolerance and just experiences with medical care. As a result, that creates risk, tremendous risk that, you know, makes me probably more afraid than whatever future I would be able to give to my future generations. It's like, will I be able to survive having kids in 2023, which is even scary to even conceptualize because of all the advancements we have in technology and medicine right now. But that is a serious reality for a lot of people. And so that really speaks to this, like, we need to rectify the harms of today to be able to create futures for the next generation.
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've got a little bit of time left, so I think we could dig into some of these issues, but the equity piece I want to hold on to for a little longer because obviously here in Boulder, we're not known for our diversity, right? We're not known for being necessarily welcoming to all types of people. And that's the same could be said, I think, for the climate movement and the history of the climate movement. So I want to talk, you brought this up, Wisdom, but, you know, the history of the climate movement wasn't inclusive. So what should the climate movement look like moving forward?
I was like, you can answer it too. I think that the future of the climate movement, it has to be led by people of color. There are generally 4 kind of things that we think about when we think about the definition for environmental racism. One is the exclusion of people of color from leadership in the environmental movement. One is the intentional just sanctioning of life-threatening poisons in communities of color. Some is the intentional just placement of these facilities and just the lack of attention when there are communities that are being harmed, the lack of resources that are being allocated for remediating issues. And so in order to create a more inclusive environmental and climate movement, we have to acknowledge that, right? Like, we have to talk about the environmental racism that exists in the climate movement and just the history of intentional exclusion of people of color, people of color's considerations when it comes to just the overall conservation movement, but even in environmental law, like the way that we talk about the way that our federal environmental laws were created did not have the protection of all people or the recognition that other laws were creating disparate outcomes for people in mind. So we think about, like, if you're thinking about cumulative impacts is something that we're like really excited about in the environmental legal world right now. So there are a few states that are developing environmental justice laws that are working to rectify some of this past harm. And so if a neighborhood, New Jersey is one of the like best examples of this, which, you know, I'm surprised by that, but go New Jersey. Something that the New Jersey environmental justice law does is it requires any new projects and facilities that are going up, their environmental impact assessment has to incorporate the impact on the community in which it will be situated, and it must consider all of the other facilities that are emitting pollution, because there is an aggregate amount of pollution that is causing adverse outcomes in communities. And so if there's a finding that it would create an even greater disproportionate outcome for the community where the facility might be situated, then there is a required stop on construction, and there's like an immediate, like there's no moving forward for it. And I think I'm hoping that more states will apply those types of laws to be able to rectify the conglomeration and the very intentional placement of hazardous waste facilities, of fossil fuel projects in communities of color, refineries, all of these things, because we're seeing just clusters of them, and we're seeing the impacts of that. On the panel I was talking on earlier, we talked about Cancer Alley in Louisiana, this 85-mile corridor from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, where people are experiencing the most severe levels and amounts of cancer as a result of these plastic facilities, gas refineries, all of these things. So when we're thinking about overcoming climate change, a large part of that has to do with getting rid of fossil fuels. But with that, it requires an incorporation of these green jobs and making sure that those who worked in these, fossil fuel economies are not left behind as we are transitioning to more renewable, cleaner resources and clean energy alternatives. So I just said a lot of things, but yeah.
Well, I pass it to her because Ariel does a really great job of convening Black women in environmental justice spaces, right? I'm a really big fan of Afrofuturism, and the future is here, right? Like, we have to be in these places and spaces. One of the highest, youngest climate advisors for the White House, his name is Jerome Foster II, young queer Black young man who is in that space, advocating each and every single day, leading rallies, leading protests, engaging in those spaces. We have to have the space to dream of a future where all of us are in it, right? When you look at sci-fi and you look at all these other places, oftentimes when you see the Black character who's the first person to die, they're literally writing us out of the future. And they're currently trying to take away our history. There are so many attacks happening from our health to our history to our education to our safety that we have to come together and really reimagine this future. And so it's going to take people coming together, convening, uplifting marginalized voices, making sure that people who are directly impacted by these issues have a say and have a voice in what this looks like. If you haven't read Octavia Butler, I urge you to go read Octavia Butler. She has some really great writings about Afrofuturism that talk about environmental justice in a way that is pretty radical, and so I really urge you to engage in that. If you haven't seen Kendrick on Hulu, go watch it and go read the book. Phenomenal opportunity just to engage in what that mental space is looking like. But we have to craft those spaces and convene people together and make sure that we are discussing this in a way that includes all of us, right? To shout out the way that we met at COP in Scotland 2 years ago. And for years I was searching for other young Black folks who were in the environmental justice movement, Googling, searching this and this, and not that many are coming up, or it's the same people popping up every year after year. And we were in a place and space with young people across the entire African diaspora who are working for climate solutions, right? Young people who are doing it from different points of view, from tech, from policy, from advocacy, and making sure that their voices are being heard. And so, I feel like we've built some type of network of people who can rely on one another, and we have to keep fostering those types of spaces. And so even thinking about the things that we can take away today, how are we creating those spaces here on campus? I think I've heard about a couple things that are happening here on campus where folks are having those discussions, but how are we making sure we center that, and that the administration here is also listening to that, and we're spreading that across the state and across the country.
And just to add to that, there are like two ideologies or ideas that I would love to just make sure that y'all have in mind. One is just world building, right? This idea of imagining improved worlds, or as my my friend Wawa describes it, loving a better world into existence, and really speaking on the value of creating more inclusive worlds. This other is the idea of radical imagination, really just being in the present, seeing what's happening now, and believing that better is possible, and thinking about what would the world look like if we got this right? and really just being intentional and sitting with that and thinking about, like, what does justice look like? What does justice feel like? How are we communicating with one another? How do we learn from each other? How are we grounding our work in love and our love for society, our love for planet, our love for ourselves, our love for this planet? There's so much love to give, right? And I think that in the movement to protect this world, there has to be something that is stronger than doom and grief and anxiety. And I think that one of the many things that exist is love and compassion. So, yeah.
Yeah. We could clap for that all day. Thank you for saying that. One thing I want to ask, and this is related to a question we got from the audience, there's the sense that we need to learn from our past. We've got to lean on our elders. We've got to learn from our teachers. Mm-hmm. And there's this sense that teachers are really fried right now. Like a lot of us are, right? Yeah. Anyone working in this space is probably fried. What are some ways that we can reinvigorate ourselves to be in this fight for the long haul? Any ideas?
I'm gonna segue to something that Wisdom was sharing about uplifting marginalized voices. Yeah. First of all, I think all of us, just by being here, we have this wonderful opportunity. We have the privilege of being here, because most of the people that are affected by climate health, they're not here. Right. We need to start finding ways to bridge that gap, to acknowledge that we need to get to these voices to be heard. Like, we see the effects in ourselves, in our communities, but there are others that still have to deal with homelessness, to work at that 12-hour, 16-hour shift. There are many people that would love to just be here and listen to these conversations, but they're not here. So what can we do about it? How can we do something to share those voices? And through education, I think it's something that is really important. How can we engage with the students to share that message? It's not just about sharing the knowledge so students can get a grade and go on and preach about it, but how can they create a difference within the community? I think it is a topic that's very sensitive. And yes, teachers have a high demand of increasing administrative work. It's hard to just approach some and say, oh, you should also teach this, or you should also approach that. But finding interesting ways of incorporating into the existing curriculum, I think it's where some of these conversations, because the younger generations are asking about it. They're seeing that as an opportunity. Mm-hmm. So there is definitely room to have those conversations. And at least on a personal level, I always try to bring this when I mention students and talk about the work I've done on a personal level, but at the same time, we must continue to share as we see it, as it goes through us. And I think this panel has done a wonderful work sharing the personal and the emotional perspective.
Yeah, Sarah, I want to bring you back in, because I think what he was saying really relates to the work you were doing to bring this curriculum into a sphere maybe where it didn't exist before. But I'm just curious to know, what are your students doing with that information? How is that impacting the work that they're doing?
Yeah, we are really excited about that. And it has an interesting history. So we've been teaching this very specialized program for less than 10 years. I think we're at about 8 years now. And it was really hard at first. If you graduate with an MSW, then only people who are doing things in social services want to hire an MSW. It's just, otherwise that degree is not recognized. So my students were graduating and wanting to work in the environmental field and immediately being rejected because they had the wrong degree.
Wow.
And that was as hard on them, even harder on them, because they all of a sudden had all this debt that they had to pay, right? And that's a whole other issue. That we should talk about. Access to knowledge. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I went on a tangent to my own brain. So I'm going to talk about equity. But now what we're starting to see is really a lot of employers recognizing that folks with interdisciplinary backgrounds are where it's at. The real world doesn't happen in an isolated academic tower where you are only knowledgeable about one certain discipline. And so suddenly now all of my students are starting, not all of them, trust me, many of them do go into very traditional social work background or fields, and that's great. Because the knowledge that they bring to a very traditional social service provider site is going to be thinking about how do we create a regenerative future, both socially and environmentally, into traditional ways of practice. And now I have students working in social workers, working in water rights, working in pollution issues, working in wildlife conservation, things that we never ever would have seen, and again, them working to, again, uphold true ecological justice. And if I may, on the teacher aspect too, I'm glad you asked, just because we have a really neat project. It's been rough working with Denver Public Schools. Those of you who live in Colorado may have heard of it. If you don't live in Colorado, we had a group of students, high school, middle and high school students, mostly high school students within Denver Public Schools, who basically came together, organized themselves. You love this story. Yeah, totally your jam. Organized themselves, brought in, some teachers and some parents, and said, we are going to approach the Board of Trustees of our school district to pass climate policy.
Awesome.
They passed it last April of 2021.
Wow.
Super exciting. One of the things then that the district promised them were lots of benchmarks that we will include climate education, environmental education in the curriculum. Of course, the infrastructure needing to be tightened up, school gardens, lots of other initiatives. So we are partnering a team of almost 10 of us from DU, working with Denver Public Schools to create a professional development curriculum to be implemented across DPS and do the research to see. Another thing, and Ariel, you're probably familiar with this, there's a lot of great work that's been done in the field of environmental education.
Yeah.
And here we are, over 50 years later. Has it helped? We don't have the data to show that it has done anything. I truly do believe that it has. So many more people are so much more aware. But what we're trying to build in this, and this is just the beauty of getting to work in academia, is we're doing the curriculum building and the way to do an iterative research process to see, does this change attitudes? Does this change behaviors? Does it change the functioning of all of Denver Public Schools? So your question is so important, and I hope maybe that story, if one of you out there is a teacher and you ask that question, find your local university. Trust me, they want to partner with you to do this work. So don't do it by yourself.
As a former teacher or a lifelong teacher, educator, advocate, I really think about this because we're currently under a teacher shortage, right? Like we said, teachers are tired, they're not being treated right, they're not being paid enough, and I don't think that we are really addressing the core problems, right? We're not, when we talk about curriculum and talk about making sure that we're supporting, we need to make this curriculum go like national and make sure that every school district has that, because that is phenomenal. But this concept of Sankofa means to go back and get it, right? That we have to really engage and teach young people what we've already learned, right? If there are things out there, how do we make sure that we incorporate that into the day-to-day curriculum and ensure that teachers are excited to teach it, right? Something that I am a big proponent of is outdoor education, right? Outdoor education, alternative education. If you're here tomorrow, we got a panel talking about outdoor education. It's going to be phenomenal, but there are so many amazing support systems and places and spaces to ensure that young people have access to that. And I think that it would do a justice for teachers to get out of the day-to-day, right? I think oftentimes we put so much weight on our teachers and our educators to have the right answers and solutions. But some of the answers and solutions are around us. And so I really love this organizing aspect aspect because we have the tools to make it a reality. The question that I consistently ask our elected officials is, what is the cost versus value when it comes to climate change, right? What do we actually value for our future? Because currently, there are certain values in place that people are implementing, but when it comes to our collective future, there's not a investment in making sure that we see that all the way through. And so we have to consistently challenge those rhetorics. I think we have to make sure that folks are seeing this curriculum. We have to practice it in place. We have to spread it. We have to. I'm a big fan of take a model and replicate it. Everything might be different. Might be different in California versus Georgia versus Florida versus New York versus DC. But there is a core basis there that we can take, that we can tweak as necessary, and make sure that everybody has a piece of that pie.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on our time, and I kind of wanted to borrow an idea from you, Ariel. She's got a great podcast called The Joy Report that I would recommend you listen to, and one of the episodes is all about radically imagining the future. And I just wanted to invite all of you to take a minute and share with us, what is your radical imagination of our climate future? And, invite the audience, too, to think about this.
Yeah, there's just so many facets of what that should look like.
Right.
I think to keep it short, I believe that a radically imagined future, and the one that I hope to see, is one that community is at the center of, that people are prioritized over profit, and that we are in a sharing economy. We don't feel like we have to be so individualistic. We rely on our neighbors. We're connecting with our neighbors. We know our neighbors. I think there's resources sufficient for everyone. There aren't barriers to access to decision-making processes, to educational things. I think that people's needs are met. Everyone's basic needs are met in the future that I envision. I have lots of other thoughts, but I want to open it up to other people as well.
I'm going to say a red, Black, and green economy, right? Red, where we really connect to the folks who are being impacted by this on a day-to-day basis, right? Blood has been lost over our collective futures. Black, because there are people from the most marginalized communities that need that access, need that support, and need to be centered when we are creating these new policies and procedures as we move forward. And green, when we're thinking about it, to be equitable, to be attributed to our futures, as well as what is necessary for Mother Earth. And so a red, Black, and green economy is what we need.
I think for me, the word regenerative immediately comes up. I don't know that we're ready for that yet, and we couldn't actually create that. People would die if all of a sudden we were practicing in fully regenerative ways. But I think we need to start first with healing our social systems and healing our relationship, humans to humans, and then being able to move forward with thinking about how are we going to actually allow the earth to heal. And then how are we going to live with each other, never forgetting those ugly pasts that you've been asking us to think about today, keeping that healthy so that we can allow Earth to be healthy and not to be cheesy or cliche, but to live in true harmony with this life-sustaining planet that we just happen to be lucky enough to be born on.
And I dream of a future where unity is at its core, whether it's at the personal level, at the community level, government level. We need to start finding solutions for everybody rather than just thinking about individuals or profits. There are resources for everybody. We need to start finding that common ground and communicate with our fellow human beings, because as it was touched at the beginning with the biodiversity, we need to start figuring it out, because there are other species also that need us to protect them in order to protect the planet as well. So I dream of a future where we can focus on those major issues and start to put those tiny differences aside and find a better future for everybody.
All right. Well, thank you so much. What a beautiful future you all have envisioned for us. Thank you on behalf of CWA for everyone coming. There is a keynote tonight at Mackey Auditorium. Begins, I think, around 5:30. So we'll see you all over there. Thank you for joining. Thank you to our beautiful, wonderful, full of wisdom panel. Thank you.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.